Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Oh yeah, this is great. I got to tell you, my name is Kevin Quinn. I have the honor of being the president of Aquinas College. I'm still a freshman here, wrapping up my freshman year. And I can tell you one thing for sure, that as a college president, happiness is a full theater. This is just a great thing. I see many faces I recognize and a lot of new faces, and I'd like to welcome all of you, especially those who are coming to our wonderful campus for the first time. You certainly picked a great day to do it. I think this has been the nicest day since the beginning of the year. And I can actually hear some birds chirping out there, which is, and even the snowbirds who have been in Arizona and Florida have returned, so we're pretty excited about that. So welcome to the 22nd annual Wege Foundation Speaker Series, 22nd annual. Since its inception, Aquinas has joined the foundation in sponsoring this series, and we are absolutely delighted to collaborate with the foundation and with the West Michigan Environmental Action Council in doing it again this year. I especially would like to thank our partnering organizations who have worked together in the planning and the public outreach for this year's network. And there's an insert in there, but I do want to indicate their names. So our 2018 partners are the City of Grand Rapids, the Grand Rapids Audubon Club, the Grand Rapids Public Schools, the Grand Rapids Urban League, the Latina Network of West Michigan, Link Up, NAACP Greater Grand Rapids Branch, Sierra Club Michigan Chapter, and West Michigan Latino Community Coalition. Please give them a round of applause. So thank you all for making this possible. I'd like to extend a special welcome to the Wege Foundation board members and the family members who are in Grand Rapids this week for foundation meetings and who have joined this afternoon's lecture. I'm going to ask you, if you're a member of the board or you're a member of the Wege family, if you'd be kind enough to stand up so that we can properly thank you for what you've done for us. Thank you so much. You and your family have made such a profound impact on so many people's lives here and making Grand Rapids not only a better place to live, but really a model for the future. Thank you. Finally, I would like to ask Johanna Osmond to come forward and introduce this year's speaker. Johanna is trustee of the Wege Foundation, and she's a daughter of Peter Wege. Johanna?
Remember to bring the microphone down. Thank you, President Quinn, and on behalf of the Wege family and the Wege Foundation board, I join you in welcoming everyone and welcoming our guests to this event. I live in St. Paul, Minnesota, and the mention of the new season coming in, the spring season, we're still waiting for it up in Minnesota. I'm sorry to tell you. We had 6 inches of snow last week. So, but this springtime really here, and it's beautiful in Grand Rapids, and it is a time to think about our relationship to nature and the environment and how it affects our spiritual selves as well as our physical well-being. My father, Peter Wege, believed deeply in the importance of nature and to us all, and in writing his books on economicology. And you know, with the idea of the beauty of nature and the season itself, we are still aware that there are deep systemic inequities in access to nature, especially among urban youth of color. These inequities have been recognized here in Grand Rapids, and with the leadership of Mayor Bliss and the Parks Director David Marquardt, the new Parks Master Plan has been developed to focus on park-deficient areas of the city. And Grand Rapids has joined other cities across the U.S. to commit to quality parks within easy walking distance of every child. Drew Lanham's life and work embodies the transforming power of nature and a commitment to equitable access. As a distinguished scholar and professor at Clemson University, he studies how humans think about nature. As a writer, he tells compelling stories about how he fell in love with nature and the impact it's had on his life. Dr. Lanham will be signing copies of his latest book, The Home Place, Memoirs of a Colored Man's Love Affair with Nature, in the lobby after the lecture. As an advocate, he serves on the National Board of Directors of the National Audubon Society and travels the nation inspiring communities everywhere to connect everyone to the natural world. He is indeed, as he calls himself, a rare bird. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Drew Lanham as the 22nd Annual Wege Lecturer.
Kathy, again. Janet. Good morning. Drew, nice to meet you, Dawn. Come on over. Who is this? Cypress. Cypress. She is totally ready. I need a fist bump on that. There we go. Thank you, baby. Oh, wow. Part of what I want us to do is to understand how birds are connected to people. That's a critical thing, because if what we study we can connect to, then we can care about. And if we can connect and care, then we can conserve. Is everybody ready? Everybody suited up? So here's a great blackback gull sitting in the water. Butterbutts are yellow-rumped warblers. Okay, bigger head, bigger bill, and typically will be a little browner.
It's just pride in my history to see another African American who has pride in the environment and who is leading and doing things and teaching other minority students and encouraging minorities and others to go into the environment and to explore.
If I'm having a bad day, if I can just step outside and walk through a nature trail or just come somewhere where I can be by myself for a minute, it means just having a chance to breathe. I feel like I'm one with everything that's going on, you know. It's just like you're at peace and everything else around you is as well.
You know, having a diverse group of folks like this out here, I think is critical. This can be a career for students, that people can actually be involved in the environment and make a living doing their passion. What are we seeing, guys?
Color shouldn't define you being able to be in the environment or not. Like, nature is so amazing that no matter the color of your skin or what you look like, you should just be able to enjoy the environment. That's how I feel.
I love birds, and I've never actually gotten to go on a birding trip with other people who like to go birding. I'm really excited. Sorry, 1 second. Okay. It was just another one of those butterbutts. But they're so cute. It's a bird, a yellow-rumped warbler.
At first, I wasn't really the bird type person, but they're growing on me. Each bird species has something different about them, kind of like us.
I totally learned that today. It's a little thumbprint, yellow on the butt. That's a weird marking.
Birds can connect us to people, and the birds can connect us to issues, really. I mean, you look at a bird and you think about flight. You think about flight, you think about freedom. Everybody wants to be free. If I can watch birds, I'm free. I am a man in love with nature. I am an eco-addict, consuming everything that the outdoors offers in its all-you-can-sense seasonal buffet. I am a wildling, born of forests and fields and more comfortable on unpaved back roads and winding woodland paths than in any place where concrete, asphalt, and crowds prevail. In my obsession, I celebrate myself and sing myself, living Walt Whitman's exaltations, rolling and reveling in all that nature lays before me. I am an ornithologist, a wildlife ecologist, and college professor. I am a father, a husband, a son, a brother. I hope to some, I hope to you, I am friend. I bird, I hunt, I gather. I am a seeker and a noticer. I am a lover. My being finds its foundation in open places. I'm a man of color, African American by politically correct hyphenated convention, mostly black by virtue of ancestors who trod ground in Central and West Africa before being brought to these foreign shores. In me, there's additionally an inkling of Irish, a bit of Brit, a smidgen of Scandinavian, and some American, Indian, Southeast Asian, and Neanderthal tossed in too. But that's only a part of my whole. There is also the red of miry Piedmont clay, plowed up and planted to pass a bitter legacy forward to something better. There is the frothy brown of spring floods rushing over a Savannah River shoal and the gold of ripening tobacco drying in the heat of summer's humid last breath. There are endless rows of cotton's cloudy white stained in history's shadow. My plumage, then, is a kaleidoscopic rainbow of an eternal ancestral hope and the deepest blue of slave-hold despair and Jim Crow's darkness. All of these hues are me. I am then, in the deepest sense, colored. I am as much a scientist as I am a black man. My skin defines me no more than my heart does, but somehow my color often casts my love affair with nature in shadow and doubt. Being who and what I am doesn't fit the common calculus. I am the rare bird, the oddity, appreciated by some for my different perspective, but discounted by others as an unnecessary nuisance, an unusually colored fish out of water. But in all my time wandering, I've yet to have a wild creature question my identity. Not a single cardinal or ovenbird has ever paused in Don Song's declaration to ask the reason for my being. White-tailed deer seem just as put off by my hunter friends' whiteness as they are by my blackness. Responses in forests and fields are not born of any preconceived notion of what should be. They lie only in the fact that I am. Each of us, then, is so much more than the pigment that orders us into convenient compartments of occupation, of avocation, or of behavior. It's easy to default to others' expectations. But nature shows me the better, wilder way. I resist the easier path and claim the implausible. I claim the indecipherable and covet the unconventional. Thank you so much for your attendance here. Thank you to Aquinas College and to President Kevin Quinn for his gracious hosting. Thank you, Johanna, and to the Wege family and the Wege Foundation for your vision, for your courage, for fighting the good fight the right way. I'd especially like to thank Mark Van Putten, Leslie Young, and my new dear friend Jill Armstrong, who I found I have much in common with. The city of Grand Rapids, there's something special here in you, and though the rapids may not be big any longer, I feel the flow increasing. And to each of you for your attendance here this afternoon. I so appreciate your presence, and I hope you will bear a little bit of patience with me as I go into professorial mode. I'd like to talk to you a little bit today. As you saw the video there, I must tell you, as we constructed that video in Maryland, on a Sunday morning, I think that's important. Because for me, that's a time of reflection, and indeed a time that I turn inward to understand more about me, but that turning inward often happens as I expand my range outward to understand what's going on with birds. And so I'd like to talk to you a bit today about this conversation outside of the lines. And I want us first to begin to think of ourselves as birds. I want us to think of ourselves first as this creature called a yellow warbler. And so this is a bit of an ornithological lesson for you. But I want you to only remember three birds. The yellow warbler, a generalist, a species that will find its way eventually back to riverbanks here that are studded with willow, cottonwood, a bird that's found everywhere. And you look at the range of this species, you see that this bird occurs everywhere. Beautiful neotropical migrant that makes its way from Central and Northern South America over the Caribbean islands, up the Florida Peninsula, often to then spread out all over what we know as North America. This is a generalist species, a species that finds comfort everywhere with relatively minor alterations to habitat. Yellow warblers are happy. Is that you? But then we go back to my native Southeast and we see a bird really much more nondescript than a yellow warbler, a Swainson's warbler, a bird of dank forest floor, a bird of canebrake, and a bird of rhododendron hells, a bird that's coveted by many birders because of its rarity, but also a bird that's hard to find unless you know exactly where to look. A bird with a ringing song. But a bird that's restricted in range. A bird that has rather specific habitat requirements. Are you a specialist and restricted in range? But then you know this bird, do you not? Kirtland's warbler, an amazing species that depends on early cirral stage, depends upon the occurrence of fire sweeping through habitats to keep jack pine young. A bird that, as I saw this male going to the top of a jack pine spire to belt out a song proclaiming its territory to someone that might not answer. A bird so restricted in range to almost be imperceptible on the map, spending winters in the Caribbean, primarily on the island of Eleuthera, then sweeping north and finding sparse hold in Michigan and few other places. Are you indeed a Kirtland's warbler, endangered, somehow limited, so limited in your range as to demand protection? That's Ornithology 101 for you today. I want to move forward now as you think about your condition as yellow warbler, as Swainson's warbler, as Kirtland's warbler, as we think about the great hordes of migrants streaming up from the south, unbound by walls, to be here with us. To think about yourselves as birds, as I've often thought about my life as a bird, to think about where your range lies. And we can begin to investigate these relationships fairly easily. We can look at habitat suitability. Certainly, we think about a bird like a yellow warbler and its habitat suitability and being a generalist, or a Swainson's warbler and where Swainson's would be. Let's think about where you would be. Do you prefer rural landscapes, the country, or are you an urbanite? Or perhaps you prefer the areas in between. Our maps tell us where we want to be. Habitat suitability not only exists for birds, it exists for human beings, it exists for every other thing. Foraging opportunity? Well, most of the warblers that we talk about are insectivores. They, especially this time of year, require diets higher in protein to support themselves. But here, you're known for green bell peppers? Well, this is one of those fanciful maps that maybe you don't want to click on too often these days, but it tells us that in my home state that we're the dip state. And so we can think about these in fanciful ways. My range is somewhat limited by where I can get good grits. It's limited by the sweet tea line. But then we become much more serious about foraging opportunities as we begin to talk about food deserts. Where can our citizens obtain foods? Are we near enough by to simply drive to get the next meal? Or is it some other effort that we have to make to keep ourselves alive? Food deserts all over the United States of America. And as we begin to think about foraging opportunity and what that means, we begin to link habitat suitability and we began to link foraging ability. So how different are we than birds? Do we take for granted organic produce, the ability to go down the street to the market that sells them? Or do we find neighborhoods that alcohol and fast food is much easier to obtain than a nutritious meal? What impact does that have on the health of any being? Mate selection? Wow, birds this time of year, if you think about what's happening with birds, those birds are coming north, they're singing these songs, waking many of us up way before we want to be. Why? Because the imperative is to find a mate, to choose a mate, or more likely to be chosen. So as we think about mate selection, we look at a map, we look at a political map, and it tells us what? It tells us who we can love, where we can love. We look at predation risk. We can look at issues of where crime exists. Or perhaps it's flipped into another risk. So all of a sudden, as we begin to think about ourselves as birds, as yellow warblers, as Swainson's warblers, perhaps as endangered species like a kirtland, what habitat do we choose? Are we on the right or wrong side of said tracks? Our foraging opportunities may be limited by income or perhaps predation risk. Do we have to think about these issues? Does it make you yellow warblers, Swainsons, or kirtlands? We can think about mortality and persistence. Certainly, if we think about why birds do what birds do, why any being does what any being does, it's all about survival. But I want us to think about something more than just survival. I want us to think about not just existing on the landscape, not just holding on by tooth and claw, beak and feather to a life barely lived, but what does it take to move beyond that to something I like to call thrival? So those are sort of the requisites we can begin to cover. We can think about habitat selection, we can think about foraging selection, we can think about mate selection, we can even think about predation. Are you affected? You're lucky if you're a yellow warbler. Maybe there's a little bit of a privilege to being a yellow warbler. Are you a Kirtland's warbler hanging on to the edge? And today that very species is taken off the endangered species list and taken to threatened, and we can cheer because it's threatened. It's all a matter of perspective. So, we've talked about the basics. We know beyond the basics of habitat and of food and of predation that behavior can have an impact on who it is that we are. 7 deadly sins. Who would track that beyond? But guess what? Every click, every discount card is a way to understand our buying behavior. So the 7 deadly sins as outlined here, and you know what? I'm going to stay in my home state of South Carolina. Somehow we're red for wrath and for lust and for pride and for envy. What impacts does lost cause have on how people treat me? Twitter, just a little thing you may have heard of. Tracking the geography of hate, where in the context of the 280 characters that you can now use, someone understanding your perceptions of someone because of a mate choice. Racist words, even more racist words. My range map by social media. How many of you have ever pulled that up? I suggest you do so. To understand your lives, to understand your range map, to understand the extent perhaps of your influence, or perhaps to understand how it is constrained. So, I like to talk about these eco-psychosocial impacts. Economicology fits into all of this as we talk about these convergences, as we talk about sustainable economies, green economies, as we talk about the ecology, as Marvin Gaye talked about the ecology, and mercy, mercy me. What's going on now is as much of what's then as present. What impacts us? Limits to dispersal. We ecologists talk about it frequently. What keeps a being from being where that being wants to be? What impacts might such a wall have on jaguars or roadrunners or ferruginous pygmy owls? Oh, human beings too. Do we consider our privilege of lower gas price versus holy ground? What does it mean to fragment a range? Or perhaps to keep freedom inside a cage? Water, it's a privilege, right? Do you consider yourself upstream or downstream? We can look at water resources and how they are protected. We think about clean air, clean water, clean soil, a requisite for all beings, whether bird, mammal, something with warty skin. We all need water. But you see here, I go back to my southeast, and a state suing because clean water is demanded by federal right. So is that something that should be changed? Is this the way that we want to advance ecologically? So, you know, I write a lot about, well, I will tell you that for a long time, I stood before audiences and I talked about ornithology and I talked about the habitat requirements of birds without linking them to people. I talked about how birds are limited by things like habitat suitability, that they are limited by foraging preference, that if they can't find mates, that if they are not able to live in environments unstressed, we may see them, but often the bird that sings the loudest is the loneliest one. So I did that for years, for decades, in fact, because what I wanted people to know me as was an ornithologist with my feather cred, that I would be able to talk with other scientists and be respected. And in some ways, ignoring my own skin, ignoring the plight of other human beings, ignoring the fact that we require the same things. I can't thrive in hate. You may see me survive in it, but thrival becomes a difficult task. So, back to the birds. As I present these connections, these convergences, these outside the lines kinds of conversations to my fellow birders and to ornithologists and to conservationists all over the country, I make the argument that even if you still say, well, it's just about the birds, I show them this map overlay, and if I block out the top of it, it becomes clear that birds like scarlet tanagers and black Burnian warblers, painted bunnings, swallowtail kites, and red knots, birds that sweep up through the southeast and in many ways characterize the area ornithologically, that even if you just care about those birds, that if you are enacting conservation policies that ignore the people underneath these birds, they cannot persist. This is the 2010 census, which essentially shows what? Concentration of black folk in the United States of America. Do we as conservation organizations simply say, well, the best thing for scarlet tanagers is, and absent the people who are under them, how do we expect burgeoning populations of black and brown to respond to environmental challenges, conservation challenges of the future, if we continue to have the conversations amongst the same crowd? That range has to be expanded. Go to South Carolina to tell you a little story. It's the place I know best. It's my home. One of the things that I admire so much about Peter Wege, what I've learned is this affection for home, this affection for where you are, and making things better where you are is, as I told the students at City High and Middle this morning, it's like dropping the stone in a pool of water. The impact is never simply centered on the impact, but spreads outward. So we go to South Carolina and we look at a little county here called Allendale. This bird is a swallow-tailed kite. Some of you may have seen these birds. Occasionally, they will wander all the way up into the upper Midwest, following primarily the Mississippi River, then fanning out. Primarily in post-breeding dispersal, young birds trying to find their way. The peculiar thing, if you go back and you look at the places where swallowtail kites like to be. So this is all ornithological data. This is the Breeding Bird Atlas. Then you come forward and you see that those are areas of high poverty. If you remember, if you were watching during the 2008 election, you may have heard about a little girl who approached then candidate Obama and asked for clean drinking water. Water without lead in it. That they were in schools where lead paint still existed on the walls and was in the water, that they had to bring water to school in order to drink it. This is along a corridor called the Corridor of Shame in South Carolina. Most people who drive, if you're not stopping in South Carolina, you drive highway or I-95, not understanding that you are driving mostly through third world. But then, oh, the birds. The beautiful birds, swallowtail kites, especially in post-breeding dispersal, those that don't wander as far north as this place, tend to find old hay fields, fields that have lain fallow for a while as grasshoppers and katydids and the like hatch out. The young find easy picking. So you can go into South Carolina and see in 1 hour more swallowtail kites than most people will ever see in their lives. The birds swarm like giant dragonflies, tails spread, wings soaring. These are birds coveted by birders. And Allendale County is good enough to make the paper when it talks about swallowtail kites. But then Allendale is one of the poorest counties in the nation. But oh, the birds. That story of Allendale County is worth telling, I think, because it is part of the failure of us as conservationists to link the birds to human plight, to link beautiful flight to sometimes pathetic plight. When I take birders out now, I no longer can ignore the human condition. When a birder said to me on a field trip, "It is amazing what our State Department of Natural Resources has done to create all of these rice plantations," do I sit silent? Or do I tell the story of 300 years of enslavement and millions of pounds of rice that made some of the richest men in the world, that ultimately contributed to a civil war? Black rails and black ducks, that habitat was created by enslaved, by black hands. And so again, back to that corridor of shame, I can go back and I can say, okay, if we're only gonna talk about birds, it's an ornithological meeting. People really don't want to hear about human rights. But then if I talk about the range maps and people making plans for what habitat will be without considering black folk, brown folk, suitability, then I think the activist in me says, stop. There are people underneath this place. This is conservation gentrification. We have to think about connecting humans to birds. I can go to the Southwest and I can do the same. I can talk about red-faced warblers. I can talk about elegant trogons. I can talk about aplomado falcons and red-faced warblers. All of these things I can talk about, but I can talk about them in the context of people. It just makes sense to connect, to go outside of our prescribed lines of conservation, not just of wild things, but the appreciation of the human condition. That we are all linked, that we all require the same air, the same clean air, the same clean water, the same clean soil. So these are considerations. You know, my students often ask, so what? For me, I would say that conservation hinges on action. It hinges on activism. That's both personal and political. Every policy that ever began with a single person's agenda, a single person's thought, whether it's going to war, whether it's treating someone kindly. Thinking and doing. Activism at the personal level. Growing the success of the conservation community will require an expansion. And this expansion of range means that we can no longer just consider the people who are willing and only able to give the mega dollars to conservation organizations. That we have to consider skill, that we have to consider knowledge as valuable as the money that someone might give. We have to think about widening the audience concerned with the environment and conservation. I mean, that's why we're here, right? To think about inclusion, but you notice that the word diversity is not there. And though I understand the importance of that word, I think about inclusion as an embracing word. Inclusive. Diversity, people really sort of want to divide and count. So think inclusion. See what happens when you develop an inclusive mindset, when you develop a mindset that takes you away from dividing and counting and possibly conquering to including, not just by skin color, but thinking about gender, thinking about mindset, thinking about economic condition, thinking about all of those things will certainly make us more diverse. But becoming inclusive, I think, is the action word. Understanding that the well-being of all of us are connected to these canaries in the coal mine. When we think about the conditions of birds, that canaries, goldfinches that would be taken down into gold mines, as levels of noxious gases became high, the birds would cease to sing and the miners would know to leave. We have to be reminded ever so often that our conditions are linked, not just birds to humans, but humans to each other. Where are our canaries in the coal mines? Have they stopped singing? And so I ask, as we color outside the lines, let's think about lenses. Since we began with an observation of what goes on beyond the binoculars, I would ask you to think about the lens through which you see. I would like to ask you about, or to think about, the lens through which our conservation organizations see, through which our civic organizations see. If we're going to talk about economicology, then we have to think about that lens. We have to think about widening that lens, the scope of those lenses. Whose agenda do we live by? Again, policy begins with a thought. What policies expand or contract our ranges? Are we living for survival to just hang on? Or are we thriving? Are we satisfied when others simply survive in the face of our thrival? How do we widen the range of better human condition? How do we initiate those changes? Again, I would argue that it begins at that very personal level. Here's another map. Greatest threat from Asian carp. That's Michigan. Top health risk from air pollution. That's New York. Highest rates of brain cancer. That's Vermont. I mean, when you look at this, you know, it paints a sort of different picture. The human condition, we can pull those out, but again, all of these, I take my students through this exercise of this rather simplistic map and ask them to expand how human health condition might impact wild things versus how the condition of wild things or nature might affect the human condition. So, what's to be done? We're divided. This is the Two Americas that Tim Wallace published in the New York Times on November 16th, 2016. Are we on an island? Are we on the mainland? How do we come together in some sort of way? If it's economics and ecology and sustainable health, how do we come together through all of this? Well, I think we have child mind. I think one of the ways to do this is to go back and to understand who it is that we are and why we got into this business in the first place. And the Lorax has to remind us, unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's just not. This is one of my inclusion heroes. Hard to hate the Lorax. Hard to put the Lorax in a political party. And then there's Horton. Horton who heard a who. Horton who insisted on recognizing individuals that the rest of society insisted were not even worthy of existing. A fanciful elephant? Fanciful beings? Don't give up. I believe in you all. A person's a person, no matter how small. And you very small persons will not have to die if you make yourselves heard. So come on now and try. Horton broke down walls. He didn't build them. And so I look at Horton and I think about his patience, its loyalty, persistence, and kindness. And I read about the Wege Foundation and the Wege family and understand that you've been practicing Horton policy. The Lorax are the same, that there are qualities there that lie in Wege name. There are heroes that don't look quite like the choir that we tend to preach to. Majora Carter in New York City, Cesar Chavez, of course, a martyr, and Rachel Carson, who fought so hard to have people understand that our silent springs not only meant death for birds, but it meant bad things for human beings. But understanding Rachel Carson's backstory, that as she wrote this story, to combat who she was, to bring good for the rest of us. And so I begin to close, and you'll recognize maybe some of these faces as we talk about range expansion, and I ask you to think about Horton, and I ask you to think about the Lorax, and I ask you to think about what kind of bird you are. It might be all sort of confusing, but we can boil it down to personal stories. We can boil it down to activism. We can boil it down to kindness. The picture you see here of these young people, the brown-skinned people that you see here are residents of a town in the eastern shore of Maryland. And many of their families, everyone has a bird story, many of their families are employed, their parents, their caregivers are employed by chicken producers. The chicken bus pulls up, takes their parents to the factory where they kill chickens, brings them back to a place where they live from paycheck to paycheck. Their children, meanwhile, live within a stone's throw, a gull's short flight of national seashore. But many of them had never been there. Their only bird story was that chickens marginally supported their families until someone who did not look like them cared a whole awful lot. Someone who didn't look like them, who didn't have the same socioeconomic background, who ignored privilege to take these kids out in a program, this particular day, to Assateague National Seashore, to see not one, not two, not three, not four, but 5 snowy owls. I was there. Suddenly, your chicken story becomes a snowy owl story. Suddenly, your range is expanded from a tiny town in the eastern shore of Maryland and paycheck to paycheck to the Arctic. Activism, expanding ranges, understanding that the lines that have been drawn are lines that we have to cross. That standing behind some line of privilege or education or money should not separate us from doing better by our fellow human beings. By wildness, by connecting those two, we expand them all. The same with these kids. Most from historically black colleges, so there's some privilege there, I would suppose. But then not being exposed to prothonotary warblers, a prothonotary warbler that left this very swamp, Beidler Audubon Sanctuary in South Carolina, leaves that swamp, goes down the Florida Peninsula, hops over to Cuba, then the Yucatan, all the way down into Colombia, South America, in about a 2-week flight. The miraculous thing, to have that bird return to within 3 feet of where it was initially banded. That's miraculous. That's being in a church with cypress boughs for a roof, with a baptismal in tannin-stained water. Whoever they worship as individuals, they all came together in the understanding that this bird was special. And so I ask you again, which bird are you? Well, I would argue that maybe the answer doesn't really matter, because this is my dream. This is Charlie Harper's portrayal of migrants plying across the Gulf of Mexico. Charlie Harper, the minimalist geometric artist of Ohio, painted these wonderful scenes, these wonderful minimalist pictures that helped us understand in ways who birds are simply by feel, sort of by gestalt. So imagine this flock. Imagine yourselves birds, whether you're yellow warbler, which is in this picture, whether you're Swainson's warbler, which is in this picture, whether you're Kirtland's warbler, which is in this picture. Whatever bird that you were, that you're in these flocks, making their way from the Yucatan, making your way across the yawning mouth of the Gulf of Mexico, flying towards some common goal of well-being, flying to something beyond simply survival, flying to something called thrival, looking differently, having different needs, coming from different places, different ecological niches, but all in the same flock. And it becomes impossible for me not to connect a bird to human plight. That's me. You can find me there. But I'd like to offer, last year was a Dick Sissel invasion. And right out, really almost my back door, Dick Sissel showed up in these overgrown pastures, and the kindness of the rancher there not to mow for about a month, really, allowed these birds not to just survive and not to be under the stress of the mower and of hay cutting, but allowed these birds to thrive. And so as you watch a male throw that head back and chick, 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 I would sit for hours and watch these birds. And it's lesson to me that if given the chance, we all have this capacity. Every one of us, as Dr. King said, to lift his or her voice and sing. And I think we can do that with nature ringing. I am so appreciative for your time, for your patience, for the Wege family's incredible benevolence and vision. Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
We have about 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A. If you would like, you can raise your hand. I can bring the mic around to you. But we also have microphones both stage right and left. So if you're able and can get out of the aisle, please feel free to line up at either mic on the side of the room. Otherwise, you can raise your hand and I'll bring the mic around to you. Keep in mind, at the conclusion of the Q&A session, there'll be a book selling and signing out in the lobby. So please join us for that as well.
I probably know the answer to this, but do you have a big following at Clemson, or do you have a lot of students and a lot of people interested in your classes?
Well, thank you for that question. Following, I'm not sure I'd call it that. No, it's I'm a teacher by heart. That's in my it's sort of in my family's blood. I've sort of counted, and I think in the 22 years I've taught at Clemson, I think about 8,600 something students I've had the opportunity to teach. That's a lot of students that I've had an opportunity to interact with, and so I'd like to think in some ways that there's been at least some impact. I always tell students I can lead your brain to knowledge, but I cannot make it think. That's the it's my mantra for them to just think, and so I hope in some way that's having an impact on them. Today was heartening being at the high school, at City High and middle school, because I got great questions from those students. You all ought to be very proud and feel really very good about the future of your education here. Clemson is home, my academic home. It's been very good to me in many ways, but one of the things that I want to do is I want us to expand beyond words to action. I want us to expand beyond talking to moving forward in different ways. One of the things, and I was talking with Dr. Quinn about it, talked to Jill about it, and just the sort of understanding of what Grand Rapids really is. And there's this gestalt, this feeling of collaboration and convergence here, that somehow there are things getting done. I know it's not a perfect place, no place is, but that people are willing to work, that people seem to be willing to talk in ways maybe that they're not talking in other places. That why haven't you fallen under the pallor of the Rust Belt like everyone else has? Yeah, you may have had your hard times, but somehow you've recovered and are recovering. I don't think recovery is ever complete. I think there's always better. There's always better. There's always a way to move forward. Just as evolution has no penultimate, I think that civic duty and doing better by the environment can always be enhanced. And so I want us to do that at Clemson. I want you to understand too, though, that sometimes speaking the truth about things will cause you not to have a big following. Or if you are being followed, you may have to look behind you. So I say all that to say I very much appreciate my home. I appreciate being able to come to a place like this and within just a little bit, within a conversation's breadth, to find commonality with people that I've never met. I mean, come on. You know, a little word, a little kindness, a little time goes a long way. You know, we pick up our heads from our phones and guess what? There's somebody standing in front of us. There's someone beside us. And there's the opportunity to do things in ways that perhaps might seem old, but they're ways that seem to somehow have worked here. So I'm going to take this back. I'm going to take this back and I'm going to say, look, you know, there are people doing things in different ways. Let's see if we can do that and maybe the following becomes bigger. So thank you for the question.
Just a simple question. I'm curious if the rancher's kindness was due to you going over there and lobbying him not to mow his field. And also, can you tell me about the dick thistle? Because I don't know anything about it.
Oh, yeah. There was a little bit of that. But I grew up on a cattle farm. So, I know about the cycles of haying and such. And so out there an awful lot. And the rancher, the farmer, and his wife often walk their collie on that road. And again, instead of sitting there and ignoring him as I'm looking at these dick thistles with my binoculars, I took my binoculars down, stepped out of the truck, stuck out my hand and said, "Hey, how you doing? I'm Drew Lanham. I'm an ornithology professor from over at Clemson, and these birds that are singing here, these are dick thistles." They're what? They're dick thistles. I said, well, these are birds that typically nest in the Midwest. These birds have just come in from Argentina. And they find your pasture really a great place to be. They're probably going to nest here. There are about 14 males that are strung out down the line, just singing their guts out. And so that this bird that's coming from migrating from South America, a little smaller than a robin, okay, primarily a seed eater, but during the breeding season eating a lot of grasshoppers and such. A bird that on the wintering grounds is often persecuted. So, the same laws for pesticides don't apply elsewhere. And so these are birds that are considered pests in some places on the wintering grounds. And so they're sprayed and thousands of these birds, tens of thousands of them die because of pesticides. And so that one bird that's singing there, I have to think about what that bird survived. And then making that transatlantic or that trans-Gulf flight to be here. So dick thistles are sort of famous for showing up in one place one year and not showing up in another place the next. because they depend upon these ephemeral grassland habitats, and dick thistles are just kind of finicky that way. And so as those birds showed up last May, I'm wondering if they're going to show up again. And if they don't, you know, I try to take the opportunity of the chance of the present when I'm watching birds to absorb them. Okay, call it obsessive compulsive disorder. But I try that, you know, I tell people that I'm odd. That's called ornithological distractive disorder. And so birds pull me in a certain way. And so that dick thistle that's singing there, that male that's singing there, when these birds, if these birds show up again, you know, that bird's not banded. I didn't try to band any of them. I just watched them. But my mind and my heart connect. And because I can't disprove that it's the same bird, I will think about the miracle that a bird returning from such a journey is. One bird. One bird. So for all that dick thistles are from, you know, this wonderful passerine, brightly colored, and a lot of prairie birds have these sort of cryptic backs, but then dick thistles have this bright lemon yellow breast and this V there. And this bird, and they'll hop up and they'll just throw that head back and just sing. And it's really not a pretty song, but it's the most beautiful song to me. And so, you know, the ecology of them intrigues me because I'm intrigued with prairies and grasslands. You know, then there are birds that you likely have. I know you have them in Michigan. So, you know, you find grassy areas, primarily if you think about places that people are trying to do prairie restoration. But in this case, it was just a farmer who took it upon his heart not to mow. And he told me one day, he said, you know, my brother really needs to mow this place. And I said, well, you know, thank you for not. I mean, really, it was just a point of, well, thank you for not. Because every time I would go, every trip I would take, I would go back and be like, oh God, what if he's mowed it? What if he's mowed it? And I remember going back from one trip, and all of a sudden there are little dick thistles out there. They're being fed, they're on the fences, you know, you can see parents ferrying back and forth caterpillars and grasshoppers. And guess what? The cycle was almost complete. And then I started seeing young dick thistles fledging and up on the fence posts. And then I saw them in the sunflower field adjacent. And then it fell silent because guess what? Nesting was done and he mowed. And so, you know, sometimes signs are required. Sometimes big crowds and marches are required. Sometimes megaphones are required. Sometimes a please and a thank you are required. So, you know, activism, I talk about conservation and social activism. It begins with a single person's thought. Begins with you being able to have a conversation with someone in a meaningful and kind way. Not necessarily parsing the truth, right? Please don't do that, but being able to have the conversations in ways that can hopefully move us forward in that flock, in that flight of Charlie Harper-esque sort of birds. There.
I apologize if I missed this at the beginning. I have two questions. One of them is what drew you personally into the field of ornithology? What sparked your interest in birds? And the second part of the question is I'm an environmental science teacher, and so I'm constantly fighting the battle of how do we get students to put down their phones, which have constant entertainment, and get them interested in going outside and observing birds. So I guess the short way to put that is how do you convince students of the importance of studying birds when there are so many things on their phone that they find more entertaining?
Okay, well, I came to birds because I wanted to fly. I wanted to fly. I watched them, and you know, I didn't know about lift and thrust and all of that, barely gravity, and so I wanted to fly, and so I would watch them, and then I would try to do what they did. didn't work. Especially, there used to be this thing, there used to be this size called husky, that for Sears jeans. And I've always been a husky guy, so I'm especially gravity prone. So that was the first attraction, and then as I read, and the world expanded through books, I began to understand that birds were traveling to places that I had only imagined, that they were flying to places that I wanted to go. And so I began to sort of live vicariously through birds, to imagine, a scarlet tanager making that flight across the Gulf, but then ending up in Peruvian rainforest. So going from seeing bobcats to seeing jaguar, what must that be like? And so thinking like a bird. When I talk about being a bird brain, I'm serious. It still takes hold of me, and I still think about what birds have to go through, and we're learning that birds are thinking. We know that crows do think, that crows count, that crows mourn. We know those things, and so that drew me and continues to draw me to birds. Your second question, okay, get ready. There are field guides on phones. So I used to swim upstream, and this is a little hard to say, and sometimes harder to enforce. But what happens? How many of you have ever been to a meeting, and someone passes around a basket and says, "Throw your cell phone in here"? How'd you feel about that? Well, we used to do that with students. Okay, we used to tell them, you know what, don't bring your cell phone here, until people they need to be warned about things happening on campuses. So, taking that very, very serious life and death sort of example, I would watch students as I said, you know what, you guys put the phone down, don't take your phones out, and them stiffening up says, oh, that's one of those, that old guy. Because this is how I sounded to them. Don't take your phones out. Oh, get off my lawn. And so what I started doing is my bird class, there are several different apps on the phone, field guide apps, and I still prefer the book, but what my field guide app does is it sings. It sings. And so I'll tell the students, you know what, if the president is calling you or something, you may need to miss class. So if you're intending on talking while we're walking, don't do that. Don't talk on the phone. I'm gonna need you to keep your head up so you don't trip over things, fall in holes. But your phone has the field guides on it, and guess what? It takes pictures. So I have students take pictures of habitats. They can Instagram those. Right? Seriously. They can do all those things on the phones. And so then it doesn't become a deterrent, it becomes a device for learning. So, I've had to change sort of where I meet students. And part of it is figuring out how to be a part of their world. To be a part of their world. Because, I want to be inclusive. And so what does inclusive mean? Does it mean that I pull them into my world? Do they pull me into their world, or do we meet somewhere in the middle? So in that Venn diagram of life, I think it's like that, It's us meeting somewhere in the middle. So I would encourage you to think about that. There are times, and if people are abusing their phones, then, call them on it, call them out on it. But really to tell them to download the field guide. There are so many learning apps for birds on phones. Lots of learning apps out there. And then to challenge them even more. And so I'll just tie up their phones. I'll say, okay, every 3 minutes I'm gonna need you to Instagram the photo of the habitat. I'm gonna need you to find a mast producing or a berry producing shrub or tree that birds would like and Instagram it. And we have bio blitzes on the phone. And then a lot of places I take them, they can't get reception. Then, so try that, and what you'll get is you'll get less resistance, and that resistance is, and now, no, you cannot use your cell phone for the test. But I think it's important for me, it was important to learn that, and that's why I tell students, oftentimes I learn as much from them as they may learn from me, probably more, in that I don't want to create this resistance that has them sort of stiffen up so that they can't learn. So with an open mind and an open heart, they're able to use that device to capture things, and then maybe, guess what? Maybe they got a couple of hundred friends who see that Instagram. You said, you were doing what? Oh man, really? Euonymus hearts a bust. Look at that thing. That is that's cool. I've seen it. I've seen it happen. So that's my suggestion. You're welcome.
We got time for one last question right up here.
We've been having a lot of robins everywhere on the lawns, and as I've been watching them and they're getting their worms, and their lawns and areas that I know are fertilized, sometimes heavily fertilized, and they seem to prefer those. They go to lawns that they're not out in open fields. They're in grassy areas where they seem to be able to grab worms. And I've been wondering what's happening inside of them. What is happening as they ingest that worm that may have absorbed this pesticide, and how do you connect that, what you know about what's happening to them, with people's habits and simple changes that could be made to better, protect birds?
Thank you. Great question. Every yard a prairie. What I've started doing is, from when we think about our lawns and we like green spaces, but our perception of what good green space is has largely been, sort of permutated to, this. So a part of this goes to advocacy. So in some communities, for example, you're forbidden, to have your ordinance may have you, if your grass gets above, 2 3/16 inches, then there's a huge fine that you've got to pay. But there are opportunities even in those neighborhoods sometimes to create beds of native vegetation, so to decrease that, the first thing, if people can keep stuff off of their lawns. The interesting thing about earthworms is that most of our earthworms are not native, right? So, there's that. But then there's a whole nother discussion about, our verbiage of native and non-native and exotic and who belongs here and who doesn't belong here. That's a whole nother discussion of sort of eco-verbiage that we need to address. But again, I think, I don't know, from an ecotox standpoint, it's not good. Now, what happens with a lot of these chemicals, the newer ones, they're supposed to biodegrade pretty quickly on contact with soil. I don't know. I can't speak to what's happening inside the robins, but I can speak to fewer chemicals, less chemicals, better chemicals. Okay? So, in that span, in some neighborhoods, you can advocate or try to get your neighborhood to move towards rewards or allowing people to have native vegetation, beds of native vegetation that break up the blocks of grass and the amount of grass that you have. And then suddenly there's less mowing. There's certainly less watering, fewer chemicals, and things get better. Okay, so instead of, I would like to say, okay, you know what? I'm gonna be at your house in a couple hours with a 4,000 horsepower tractor and a 60-foot disc harrow, and I'm gonna make a prairie in your yard and not leave a space. That's not realistic. The realistic part is thinking about, okay, so how can we integrate breaking up lawns to introduce native vegetation for not just for birds, but for pollinators and the like, so that we begin to make things better. Make things better. So that would be my recommendation there, and go to your neighborhood association and find out. I know now there are some neighborhoods on the coast in South Carolina that it's all native vegetation. That's the covenant there. In many places in the Southwest, it's xeriscaping. All right, so xeriscaping works in a lot of places. So we're all going to face water issues, folks. If you're not already, they're coming. They're not just a Western or desert thing. In South Carolina, Atlanta wants our water. Atlanta wants our water, and as Atlanta grows east and Greenville grows west, the Chattooga, the Savannah River is crunched between it, and there's this quiet policy battle going on over water. And we got to figure out how to live together in more sustainable ways. I would argue that native sunflowers blooming on a hardly cared for prairie make a huge difference. They're beautiful. So I don't know, is there a native planting program here in Michigan, like on the shoulders of roads and the like? Okay. So there's already policy there. How do you expand that? How do you expand that? Is that my time? Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Wege Family and Foundation. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming.